everyone. I'm Madeline Heim, health and science reporter for the Post Crescent and USA Today Network Wisconsin. It's been over a year since our last interview for Newsmakers Coronavirus Edition, but unfortunately, the pandemic is still with us. After a relatively calm summer, the rise of the more contagious Delta variant has cases soaring again. In Wisconsin, we're averaging more than 3,000 new cases per day, and less than 60% of Wisconsinites are fully vaccinated against the disease. However, that number will bump up with the arrival of the vaccine for kids ages 5 to 11. Like with any vaccine, parents might have questions or want some more information about the vaccine before they decide to get it for their child. So I'm joined today by Dr. Sarah Campbell, a pediatrician with Ascension Wisconsin, to talk about some of the most common questions about the vaccine for kids and where adults can go if they want other questions answered. So Dr. Campbell, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about pre-Delta, when it was looking like, this might be sort of the end of things. Adults were getting vaccinated. I know I myself was really thinking that, we might be seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. But that wasn't the case for parents with young children who weren't able to be vaccinated yet. So I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit personally about some of the challenges of having kids who weren't able to be vaccinated. And then once this vaccine for kids was available, how did you decide that you wanted your kids to get the shot?
It's been really an interesting 18, 20 months. And for us, 2 of our children were not eligible to be vaccinated until a few weeks ago, 2 were. So our family had 2/3 vaccination over the summer. And I think we grappled with a lot of what other parents did was balancing the risk of our children not being vaccinated and participating in activities, figuring out what activities we felt had lesser risk of infection, which activities have higher risk of infection. Many respiratory viruses tend to abate a little bit into the late spring, early summer, and then we often see that uptick into fall with the return of school and such. So for us, we really worked on how to let our kids still be kids, how to let them be physically active, how could we have them in school in what we felt was the safest manner while they were unvaccinated, while still trying to provide as much protection as we could from our home in terms of having my husband and I vaccinated, having our older children vaccinated, trying to really know our community, our group of friends, to try to keep our exposure as limited as possible. So that's kind of what we did leading up into getting the vaccine. In terms of making the decision to get vaccinated, for me, it was really easy. I've been following the development of the vaccine. I've been following the process of it. I think it's really exciting looking at the collaboration that we had between our government agencies, our pharmaceutical companies, and our researchers to work together to really streamline the process of coming up with a vaccine. Behind the scenes, we have lots of vaccines we're working on in industry and in the scientific community, but being able to get that collaboration so we had real-time ongoing studies to get the vaccine. I felt very confident that, in the US, we'd given 300 million doses of the vaccine. I felt that the rollout with the 12 to 15-year-olds went pretty well, and following and looking at that safety data, they were vaccinated in May. And so, come November, we're 6 months later, 5.5 months later, we've been through that already. And so I felt very comfortable with the vaccine. I really liked the process that they did in terms of, in those phase 1 trials, figuring out what is the appropriate dose based on the child's age and their immune system to get the maximum immune response with the minimal side effects. So I felt very reassured that we had done all the right steps. We'd done the testing and that the vaccine was safe for my kids. And it was a pretty exciting day when we were able to get that first dose in a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to come back to that, a note about the dosing. But first, I wanted to touch on, I think that throughout the pandemic, we've seen COVID not hit kids quite as hard, which is great. It seems to hit them less severely and less often than it does adults, particularly older adults. And I think that might lead to a natural question for parents of, if COVID's not so bad for kids, why should I get my child the vaccine? So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the importance of the vaccine for children, even as we know that COVID might not be quite as severe for them.
I think as a parents, we always hope, we wish, we pray that our children are never going to be that one or that exception, right? We always know that there's risk, but we think, oh, it's not going to be my kid. But we know in Wisconsin that we have seen kids hospitalized with COVID. We have seen kids with myocarditis. I've had a couple of patients in my practice who've been hospitalized with COVID. So although luckily the significant illness seems less severe in the majority of kids, it's not completely benign for children in general. When I looked it up on the health department, I think they said about 1% of kids get hospitalized with COVID. I was listening to a talk, and a third of the kids who are hospitalized end up in the ICU, and a good hunk of those don't have pre-existing conditions. So yes, COVID, by and far, kids do pretty well with it. It's a couple days of a sniffle, but we do have kids who have long haul. We do have kids and adolescents who still are not smelling and tasting 6 months later, which is really scary and really impactful in their life. We do have kids who have complications, and unfortunately, there are kids in the US who have not survived their COVID infection. So you never want to be that one, right? You never want to be the one kid who gets the post-inflammatory syndrome and gets hospitalized because your heart's really unhappy in the ICU. But if you talk to the doctors down in Milwaukee and Madison, they have more than enough cases to tell you that COVID is real and it does affect children. And, we never want it to be our children, but sometimes it is our child.
Yeah. So the Pfizer vaccine is currently the only shot that's approved for kids ages 5 to 11, although it looks like we will see some data from Moderna soon. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what makes the Pfizer shot for children different than the shot for adults.
So I think the biggest difference is the dose. The dose for 12 and above is a 30 microgram dose. The dose for 5 to 11-year-olds is 10, so it's 1/3 of the dose. And we know that kids are not little adults. We know many of the vaccines we give are the same dose, whether you're a newborn or you're a 75-year-old person. However, we did the studies, Pfizer did the studies, Moderna's doing them, I assume Johnson & Johnson is doing them, looking at what is the optimal dose. So what is the smallest dose that we can give kids to get the best immune response and the smallest amount of side effects? And that's what we found out during those phase 1 clinical trials was, kids in this 5 to 11-year age group, their immune system's very robust and they get by with that smaller dose. So they only need a 10 microgram dose versus the adult, which is a 30 microgram dose. That's the biggest difference, is just the dosage, which is more age-based in terms of how the body responds to the vaccine.
Gotcha. And, I think you touched on this a little bit with the studies, but just to ask it more explicitly, how do we know that lower dose is going to be enough to protect the kids, given that, the adults are getting a higher dose?
So I'm not a scientist, but all vaccines go through the same trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And that first phase of trials really is testing the different doses. So testing 30, 20, 10, 5, 3. So that those first set of kids who were in those initial trials, that was what it was, to see if we give them this dose, do we get the appropriate immune response that we're expecting? And what are we seeing for those side effects? So when we look at it, right, we have a 6-month delay from that 12 to 15-year-old studies that were the same adult dose versus these younger kid studies and that approval. And my assumption that's because they did those early phase 1 studies to really look at what is the appropriate dose, and is that dose different in the littlest of kids? We expect that dose will be a smaller dose than what the 5 to 11-year-old is.
Right. To talk a little bit about side effects, because I know that was a very talked about thing when the adult vaccines were coming out. I know that the second dose for me kicked my butt a little bit. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what side effects we're seeing typically in children with this vaccine.
Well, I would say one thing in pediatrics is we give a lot of vaccines, so we know a lot about vaccine side effects. Most of the time it's a sore arm, maybe a headache, maybe some malaise, maybe a fever. We know that, I think the vaccines, part of where they work is in your lymph nodes. So we've seen a lot of reports in the adult population of swollen lymph nodes, kind of painful lymph nodes. Those are the most common side effects that we see, and they're very similar to the side effects that we see from an influenza vaccine or some of the childhood vaccines we see. And those respond well to rest, fluids, Tylenol or ibuprofen if the child's really uncomfortable.
Gotcha. And I did want to mention too, that there have been these extremely rare cases of more adverse effects all across the board, including myocarditis after the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
So, what should parents watch for if their child gets the vaccine and they think they might be starting to see something that's outside the norm?
So I think the post-vaccine myocarditis most commonly is seen after the second dose, not the first dose. The big age group that we've seen it really is in that 15 to 22, 23-year-old male population. That seems to be where they saw it. Most of the time it was some shortness of breath, some chest pain, maybe feeling of irregular heartbeat. That was normally a couple days after the vaccine. Most of them were very self-limited, didn't require much intervention. And what we know is that the myocarditis post-vaccine tends to be much more mild and limited than the myocarditis that we are definitely seeing in all age groups with COVID, particularly in kids when we're looking at the MISC and some of those complications. A lot of those are involving very significant myocarditis or heart inflammation. And so although we see it, we know your risk of getting myocarditis from the infection is much greater than a post-vaccine myocarditis. But the core symptoms would be shortness of breath, chest pain, funny feeling in the heart. And obviously, we would want you to see your provider just to double check to make sure nothing else is going on.
So I also wanted to touch on just something that might affect just a small portion of the population. But, let's say that a parent has a kid who's 11 right now, but might be turning 12 in the next couple months. And obviously in the next couple months then could qualify for the larger dose of the vaccine. Would you recommend getting the smaller dose for the 5 to 11-year-olds now for that child, or waiting to get the larger dose after they turn 12?
I would get the dose now. I wouldn't wait for that second, for the birthday to turn that, just because we know we are seeing COVID cases increase, especially in the Fox Valley. Those cases are going up. We're seeing pediatric cases increase in the Midwest right now. At least the last couple of weeks, the trend has been unfortunately up, not steady or down. And I think there's nothing that magically happens on the birthday, right? It's not like all of a sudden our immune system changes dramatically 10 days later or 2 weeks later. So I think that you get the age appropriate dose that your child is. Some kids will get that first dose now and then get a bigger dose if they turn 12 in that intervening 3 weeks or whenever that second dose is given. And we also know if for some reason they got the wrong dose, that's not going to cause a big difference. If, they got the smaller dose and they turn 12, they should still get a very good immune response. Our immunity, it's a continuum, right? It's not like all of a sudden we see big things. We just kind of look at that trend, and we have to pick a date and an age, especially if we are doing different dosages based on age. So the long and short, get the vaccine when you are ready to get the vaccine for your child. Don't delay getting the vaccine just because they're turning 12. Um, and it's fine if they get one dose at one age and one dose at another age.
Yeah, that's really good to know. So a general question about vaccines is that, kids and needles don't always mix. I know I was not a fan of getting shots when I was younger. And so, as kids are moving into this phase and getting the COVID vaccine, what should parents do if their child is a little bit anxious about that shot?
So I think we know our children, we know what works for our kids. So one, if they have a lovey or a stuffed animal or a security blanket or something that makes them comfortable that they want to bring with them, I think that that's great, because we all have our security objects. Two, I think as parents, we have to acknowledge our child's fear and acknowledge that it's okay to be scared. It's okay to not want a shot. It doesn't mean we don't do it, but we can talk a little bit about what's going to happen and what are we worried about. We give a lot of shots at 11, and a lot of kids are really nervous at 11. So I'll often talk to the kids about, do you play basketball? Well, have you ever fallen and hit your elbow on the court? And we talk about how much that hurts. And we talk about the vaccine's not going to hurt anywhere nearly as much as that bang to your elbow did. But it's scary because we know it's coming up. We know it's going to happen. When we have an injury, we don't know it's going to happen. So we're not so anxious beforehand. But we have a lot of things that cause pain that we get through. It's just when we have a shot, we know it's coming up. We are going to get nervous. But it's really important that we stay relaxed. And it's okay to cry, but we have to, try to stay calm for the nurse who's giving it to us or for the medical assistant. So I think it's really important to acknowledge the fear, but acknowledge that we're going to be strong, we're going to be brave. We don't let the fear stop us from doing it. But what are things that we can do to try to make it a little less stressful? I'm a big fan of ice cream. I believe ice cream after shots is always a good idea.
I would definitely have to agree with that. So if parents are still hesitant about getting the vaccine for their child, they've done some reading, they've done some discussing of it, and still have some questions or concerns, what should they do about that? Where should they go?
Well, I think this is one of the hard issues is there's so much information. And I think all of us throughout this process of this pandemic have really struggled to figure out what is good, accurate information I can trust. So one, your pediatrician or your family practitioner, right? They're someone that you trust to care for your children in their best of days and their worst of days. So calling and asking them, getting their opinion on it. I am a big fan. There's a website called healthychildren.org, and it's put out by the American Academy of Pediatrics. And they have a ton of resources that are updated on there, and they're coming from pediatricians. So they have a whole, ask the expert about that question of myocarditis following the vaccine. They have a really great question and answer on how is the vaccine developed? How is an mRNA vaccine different from a viral vector vaccine? What is the process? What is the history on using this technology? Because it's been around for decades. We're just using it in a new application. So the reference I give parents is healthychildren.org because they have a abundance of resources that are updated on a fairly live basis as we get new information. And I tell my family, send me a message in the portal. I'll answer the questions to the best of the knowledge that I have, and I'm happy to give my professional opinion. Lots of parents just want to know, Dr. Campbell, what did you do? Did your kids get your shots? So, I will share that with them because sometimes that's what they need to hear is, okay, well, Dr. Campbell loves her kids as much as anything in the world. So if she's okay with that, maybe it's okay. But talk to your doctor or healthcare provider. That is your local source of information.
Yeah, most definitely. And I wanted to close out, combine my last question with a question we got from an audience member who was asking that, and talking about how we're seeing a lot of the mitigation efforts maybe decreased or rolled back. I know some schools are going mask optional these days, even as Delta is still definitely on the scene. And so this person was wondering kind of what is that risk, especially for kids under 5 who are still not able to get vaccinated? And then I am hoping to close out with, do you know anything about when there might be a vaccine for kids under 5?
So that's the easy question. Everything that I've read or seen most recently is we're hoping early 2022. Now, whether that's January 1st, February 1st, or March, I don't know, but consistently I've heard probably first quarter. I know from some different COVID groups I'm in, they've been enrolling the little kids, the 6-month to 5-year-olds. Those studies have been going on. We anticipate for Pfizer that dose is going to be 3, so 1/10 of the adult dose, and 1/3 of that dose for the 5 to 11-year-olds. So I think that there is a lot of hope coming up, and I think that we are within a 3 to 5 month span where we will have the ability to get everyone 2 and over, probably 6 months and older. I don't know where those age groups are, but that's everything I've seen and heard is first quarter 2022. I think that every family has to figure out their balance of risk and what their risk tolerance is, for those little kids. Like we talked about, luckily, most kids with COVID do really, really well. I think a lot of those post-inflammatory MIS-C cases, my understanding is that they tend to be more of the school-aged children. So hopefully most of those families will have had the opportunity to be vaccinated before some of the mitigation changes happen in January. I think that we also go back to basics, hand washing, hand hygiene. If we're not feeling well, staying home, or as caregivers, getting ourselves tested. Little kids get lots of their stuff from their parents and caregivers. So I don't have a perfect answer. I think, again, that's a case-by-case basis that you can talk to your healthcare professional about of what is your comfort for you and your family and your children. Because there are no right or wrong answers, and what's right for one family may not be right for another family. People need to work. They need to be able to tend jobs. They need to be able to provide for their families and do things. So I think we always approach it with compassion, respect, and we always defer back to the individual's healthcare provider on what is appropriate for them in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great note to end on, and I think we will wrap it up there for today. But thank you so much, Dr. Campbell, for being with us and your expertise on this topic. And thanks to everyone who's watching for tuning in. I hope you all have a very safe, happy, and healthy holiday season.
Thank you.